Shalom, Rabbi, and thank you for taking the time to participate in my program. We're here today, Monday, June 17, Yud Aleph B'Sivan, with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin in New York City. Rabbi, how do you prefer to be called?
I generally ask people to use my first name, Joseph.
Joseph, okay. Rabbi Telushkin has been on the Newsweek list of 50 most influential rabbis in America for 25 years. An American rabbi, a lecturer, best-selling author, you've written more than 15 books about almost every topic, about Jewish ethics, Jewish literacy, Jewish humor, as well as the book about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a New York Times bestseller. Rabbi Telushkin served as the spiritual leader of the Los Angeles Synagogue for the Performing Arts. Rabbi Telushkin was a former director of education at the non-denominational Brandeis Bardin Institute, a senior associate with Klal and member of the board of directors of the Jewish Book Council, and is married to Dvorah Menashe and has 4 children. Rabbi, you grew up in Brooklyn, attended Flatbush Yeshiva, and studied history in Columbia University. You have a long list of accomplishments. Of all your accolades, which is the closest to your heart?
An author of books that have introduced many, many people to Judaism. But what I sort of really think of as my lifetime profession is being an ambassador for the Jews. I want to bring Jews out into the world in a way so that people who interact with me have a genuinely positive feeling about Jews and Judaism. Since I customarily wear a kippah, and so I know that people immediately identify me as being an observant religious Jew. So when I say I see myself as an ambassador for the Jews, I want anybody who has any interaction with me to come away with a good feeling about Jews and Judaism and me. And we should be scrupulously honest in our dealings. Yes.
What you're saying is a tall order. Not only do we have to do the right thing for ourselves, but we have to always be aware of that what we do in a big way has big influence on how people judge our entire clan.
Yes, that's right. So that's why I want each of us to see ourselves as ambassadors for the Jewish people.
Rabbi, most rabbis held their congregation, but you see your congregation as the entire Jewish community in the United States and beyond. I've heard you speak often and you've written many books. How did you imagine your future when you started your derech, and how did you develop this grand encompassing life?
My life was very deeply affected by a friendship I forged when I was 15. As you mentioned in speaking about me, I went to the Yeshiva of Flatbush. And after that is when I went to Yeshiva University. But at the Yeshiva of Flatbush, my sophomore year, I became friends with Dennis Prager, and we've been very best friends. I mean, Dennis and I are now shocked when we realize it's now over 60 years. And we affected each other. Dennis always had more of a vision, I think, of moving out very broadly into the world. And once I started writing, I knew I was writing books. I wanted the books to be accessible to Jews from all backgrounds, which, was fortunate because I wasn't only writing for an Orthodox group. So I wanted to make Judaism, as I understood it, accessible. I've long been struck by the fact that one of the sad things that happened in modernity is that the word religious became associated in people's minds exclusively with ritual observance, which is not, God forbid, to say that people who are religiously observant are not ethically observant, but that's not how they define their religious commitment. If 2 Jews are speaking about a third, which is not so uncommon in the Jewish community, and the question is raised, is so-and-so religious, the answer will usually be based only on the person's observance of Bein Adam L'Makom, of the personal religious practices. Does he or she keep kosher? Does he or she keep Shabbat? But nobody's going to say, oh, he's not a religious Jew. He speaks Lashon Hara. What people might say is, he is a religious Jew who speaks Lashon Hara, which isn't appropriate. But they don't see it as getting to the essence. And for Hillel, of course, that was the essence. Many people know the story of the non-Jew who asked Hillel to define Judaism's essence concisely while he was standing on one foot. But most people, unless they're looking at the story straight in the Gemara, don't really recall that that's not really what the non-Jew asked Hillel. He asked him even more specifically. He said, Gaireni almanat, convert me to Judaism on the condition that you can teach it to me while I'm standing on one foot. And it's in response to that Hillel doesn't first speak about faith and doesn't speak about Shabbat and doesn't speak about Yom Kippur, but he says, what's hateful, Da'alechasani, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. Zekol Torah kula. The rest is commentary. Tseil mad. Now go and study.
Basically, what you're saying that in your view, being religious is being a mensch.
Yes, very much. And Judaism tremendously amplifies that possibility by offering us a lot of ways to be a mensch. I'll just give you one example. As we're talking, just popped into my head. There's a Mishnah in Baba Metzia, which is one of the major, the word tractate, it's not a word people normally know. In the Mishnah, though, it's a very major work. And in Perek Daled, in the 4th chapter of Baba Metzia, one of the laws it has is you're forbidden to ask the storekeeper the price of an item if you're not really seriously considering buying it. That's a very subtle sort of law. You can't arbitrarily raise somebody's hopes and when there's no chance that you're going to satisfy them. So you have to worry. We're all conscious of consumer rights. Guess what? Judaism has a notion of consumer obligations.
It's fascinating. Basically, you're saying be kind, and I think we know it, but we don't focus on it. And I think it's important to remind people, frame it on your doorpost next to your mezuzah. My religion is being kind. I think it should be a good bumper sticker. Rabbi, my theme is about tradition and its transmission throughout the generation. You're an important link in this chain, as all of us are. Can you tell us about your family? Tell us about yourself as a child, the important people in your life, the influence that made you who you are.
I was raised in a very traditional Jewish family. One of my grandfathers, my paternal grandfather, Rabbi Telushkin, was a very prominent rabbinic scholar, and I spent a lot of time with him. We used to go to his house for all the chagim. He lived in a neighborhood that at that point was declining in safety. We lived in the Midwood area of Brooklyn. He lived in East New York. And during the years, my early years, his neighborhood was declining in a sense in safety. In the last 5 years of his life, he moved from East New York and lived very near us in the Midwood area of Brooklyn. And in the last years of his life, I used to learn with him. When I was learning with him, I was in my late teens, and he was in his late 80s. I'm not there yet. I'm 75 now. But my grandfather stayed in mentally very good shape until very late. And my parents were both very much models of what I want to be. My wife, Devorah, only knew my father a little because he died after we had met, but before we had gotten married. And my wife has said to me on more than one occasion, whenever you have a tough decision to make in your life, it could be involving an ethical or other issue. She said, ask yourself what you think your father would have done. So that's the sort of person I'm talking about. And my mother, too, was very straight. Many of the abilities that I have that I utilize in public, my speaking abilities, more have come from my mother. My father was an accountant. He gave a weekly shiur in Talmud, but my mother, I got more of my sense of humor and those things. My mother, in some ways, was a bit of a pessimist. And one of her lines that very much impacted my friend Dennis was, the only people I know who are happy are people I don't know well. You know, yeah. My mother had a number of very funny lines. Another one, she said, it's not really funny, it's more poignant. When it's not terrible to be a Jew, it's wonderful.
The sense of humor that we have developed, it says like a shadchan is matching a boy to a girl, and the father of the girl says, but he's limping, he has a short foot. And he says, no, the other foot is longer.
That's funny. That one I've never heard.
But that's the kind of sense of humor we've developed in when we're not miserable, we're happy.
Yes. No, that's true. Listen, and right now, of course, starting with the terrible attack that Hamas launched on October 7th, there's a lot of unhappiness and pessimism in the Jewish community. I remember on October 7th, as the reports were coming in more and more, and every report was even worse than the preceding, thinking, at least now we're going to get more sympathy in the world for Israel's efforts to fight terrorism. It never occurred to me for a minute that this was actually going to be seized upon by anti-Semites as an event of which they were very happy and proud. I could not have imagined that.
Yeah, I read yesterday a letter that Herta Müller, a Nobel laureate from used to be in Soviet East Germany. Now she's a member of German society. She wrote a very eloquent letter, and she pointed that it's the sinister approach of the post-October 7 and the goals that those people have is to link the Shoah, which October 7 kind of reminds us of, with our colonial attempt to take over land from other people. So people can never think of the Holocaust, us as victims anymore. A lot of people have tried hard to bring us down. We often think post 1948, when we have a state and an army, that kochi and otzem yadi, we can take care of our problems, but maybe this is the time of God's help. Yeshua, we need a lot of help these days.
Yes, we certainly do. Achad Ha'am, who was he was not so actively Zionist, but he was a major figure calling for a revival of Jewish culture, its impact on Jewish life. He once said something startling, and then he obviously explained it. He said there's only one good thing that can be said about the blood libel. The blood libel is, of course, the accusation that Jews kill non-Jews and drink their blood and use it in religious rituals. He said, normally when a lot of people say something bad about you, it undermines your self-esteem, and you start to wonder, can the whole world be wrong and we Jews alone are right? And then he said along came the blood libel, and we could see whole large populations believing the most awful things about Jews, and yet anybody who's been raised as a Jew knows that it's an utter lie. Jews never drank, God forbid, or used anybody's blood in a ritual. And the same thing now. Because the Jews were victims of genocide, so the enemies of the Jews want to show, and Jews are just as bad as anybody else. Now Jews are carrying out a genocide, which is so frankly ridiculous. I mean, again, when it comes to anti-Semitism, common sense plays no role. In 1938, there were 18 million Jews in the world. Now, 75 years after the Holocaust, in which we lost 6 million Jews, we are still not back up to 18 million. On the other hand, in 1949, when the Israeli War of Independence ended, there were 156,000 Arabs living in the state of Israel. Now there are over 2 million, which is an increase of about 13-fold. When Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza in a war of self-defense in 1967, their combined population was about 1 million. Now it's approaching 5 million. This is not genocide. If anything, this is a population explosion. And yet the world is willing to say that about Jews.
So what did the Chad Ha'am say?
No, Chad Ha'am said, so the one good thing you could say about the blood libel is it's helped protect Jews against having a lowered self-esteem in the face of the world's hatred. Because every Jew who's born and raised among the Jews knows it's an absolute lie. And you'll say, yeah, but look how many people say it's true. But we know it's not true. So now, if they're trying to spread among university students a belief that Jews are carrying out genocide, any Jew knows this is a lie.
I thought you were going with the other angle where a wife is asking her husband during the Nazi Germany, why you're reading the Strimmer, which was the Nazi paper. He said, I never felt so good reading how powerful we are. We're controlling the world.
No, that joke, in my view, explains a half century of history. The version of it, I'll tell it very briefly, but the version of it I know, in the 1930s, because there was nothing to joke about the Nazis by 1940. But in the 1930s, a Jew was traveling on the subway reading the Forwards, the Yiddish newspaper, and to his shock, he sees his friend reading the local New York pro-Nazi newspaper. How can you read? It goes, how can you read that Nazi rag? He says, so what do you read in the Jewish paper? In America, there's a depression going on. Jews are assimilating. In Palestine, Arabs are rioting and killing Jews. In Germany, they've taken away all of our rights. You sit there and you read the Jewish paper, you get depressed. I read the Nazi newspaper. We own all the banks. We control all the governments. Why do I say that joke explains a half century of Jewish history? Because when Zionism starts as a movement, most of organized Jewry opposes it. In the Orthodox world, we know there was widespread opposition because it was a secular movement. There were exceptions, Rav Kook being, of course, a very noted exception. In the Reform world, there was widespread opposition because they thought it would call into question Jewish loyalties to the countries in which they lived. Again, there were exceptions, Abba Hillel Silver, Stephen S. Wise, and Jews on the left, who were numerous, opposed it because they felt that Jews should be loyal to the workers of the world, not specifically to Jews. Again, with the exceptions, the whole Mapai, the Labor Party in Israel. When does world Jewry start to become overwhelmingly pro-Zionist? The day Hitler's elected. And as Weizmann, comes to say, there are two sorts of countries in the world, those that want to expel the Jews and those that don't want to admit them. So right now, the anti-Zionists, knowing very well what happened when Jews had no country, want to see Jews again deprived of a country.
Rabbi, much of what we know about you comes from your many lectures and books. But prior to that, in the 1970s, you became an active leader in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. You visited the Soviet Union and met with dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov, who was listed as an anti-Russian agent. Was this the most daring of your accomplishments?
Yes, it was. And I cannot claim to be a particularly physically courageous person, but that's the one time in my life when I was sort of willing to not worry about that. I remember I went with my friend, the late Richard Stone of blessed Alav Shalom, of blessed memory. And I remember we were standing with the Jews outside the main synagogue in Moscow, and the Russians had a tradition. They had allowed the Jews one day a year, the evening of Simchas Torah, somehow to dance and to act very Jewish. But they had limits to it, and then it got late at night, and they announced that all the Jews should break up and go home. And then a group of really tough-looking Soviet youth joined arms and just started marching. And if you were in your way, they didn't care. The man who was standing next to me, they stomped on him and they fractured his leg. And I remember at that time I was thinking, whatever's going to happen to me is going to happen. I'm putting this in God's hands. Fortunately, Richard and I did not get physically hurt. But yeah, that was the most daring thing. And you're right. I had nachas later on when a friend of mine who was researching things, there was a short period of time when you had more access to things in the Soviet Union, found my name listed as being an anti-Russian agent.
Which we know you are.
It ignited in me such a lifelong hatred of communism. Look, obviously, growing up as I did, obviously I have a lifelong hatred of fascism, Nazism. We know that a lot of Jews were attracted to communism. It was really a horror. There's a wonderful quote attributed to Irving Howe, who was a very prominent socialist in the United States, but who had a positive feeling about his Jewishness. And he said, "In the warmest of hearts, there's a cold spot for the Jews." And what he meant was that in the left, which seems to always have a cold spot, which seems to always assume that the weaker party is right, they have a cold spot and an indifference for Jews. And as it's also been pointed out, for much of history, the world just respected strength. And during that time, the Jews were weak, and we were not respected because we were weak. Now, in left-wing intellectual circles, there is greater respect, powerless. And it's during a time when Jews finally got some power.
So when we were powerless, they respected power, and when we have power, they respect powerless.
Yes, yeah.
You bring an interesting point about when you mentioned fascism and communism, that you dislike both. And this word that ends with ism, which is all ideologies, it brings us to today, where, we have left and right, empathy and right wing, kill them all. Would you say that all ideologies are wrong? And I distinguish between ideologies and faith. Faith is not an ideology, it's a way of life that is attributed to edicts of moral and ethics and kindness. But ideology is a theory about how should we run the world. Can you elaborate on this?
Many of the isms have been terrible for us, Nazism, fascism being the most obvious examples. But many of the isms get carried to extremes, even feminism, which I'm a supporter of. But any ideologies which try to depict very large groups as being inherently bad are bad. I mean, obviously, the one ism through which I want to see the Jews try and influence the world is Judaism, because that's also an ism. The danger today, and this is a statement about ideologies, there are three groups today for whom hatred of Jews is their primary, most overriding passion. One, which we all know to be the case, is Islamism. Again, I want to emphasize what I am not saying. I am not saying Islam. There are forces in Islam that we really can reach out to and that we must reach out to. But there are also Islamism, which believes in Islamic power and when people speak of monotheistic faiths, they speak of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But what matters to me more than monotheism is what's called ethical monotheism, a belief in one God whose primary demand of human beings is ethical behavior. Islamism is not ethical. The God of the Islamists is actually an evil God. And what do I base that on? What do they shout when they commit terrible crimes? Allahu Akbar, God is great. The last words, as far as we can tell, that were heard by the passengers on the 4 planes that were crashed on 9/11 was Allahu Akbar, God is great. They have called it out when they've raped women. I mean, could you imagine? This is the classic example of non-ethical monotheism. So one group is the Islamists. The second group is the left, particularly the far left. How do I possibly claim that their primary passion in their life is to cause harm to Jews? It actually, I believe, can be proven very easily. Anybody who's on the far left or on the left or liberal very much believes in the equality of women. They believe that even microaggressions, somewhat offensive comments made against women are terrible. The fact that the left, or certainly the far left, is willing to overlook rape, but only when it's committed against Israeli and Jewish women or foreigners who are visiting Israel, obviously means that hatred of Jews is their primary passion.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they consider rapists to be terrible people. And there's a second substantiation of it. Obviously, people on the left are very sensitive to issues of any gay discrimination against gays. And they know very well that Hamas kills or imprisons gays and Israel doesn't. But you know what? As long as it's Jews you're killing, you can be anti-gay, you can be anti-women. Doesn't matter to us.
I ask you a difficult question. Do you think among the groups that want dominance, are there also Jews? You know, we know that there are forces in Israel's ideological thing. If we talk about political people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but in general, there is this idea that merges the rebuilding of the temple and Jewish manifestation by, Jews are going to control the world and some. Maybe they're not saying it in those words. Do you see this as a danger as well?
Extremes almost invariably tend to lead to terrible, terrible things. So, yes, when I saw something that Smotrich said, how he thought it was terrible that in Israeli hospitals, women who are about to give birth could be in beds alongside each other, a Jew and an Arab. This is terrible. I mean, this is not who we are as Jews.
Just to clarify, he doesn't like it and you think it's okay, just to make sure.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he doesn't like it. No, and it's particularly shocking for me to hear a Jew advocating the sort of positions that were taken in Germany in the 1930s. Don't want Jews and Arabs can be on beaches together, things like that. But then you have Jews on the other extreme, the left-wing extreme. There's an organization that's gotten a lot of publicity called Jewish Voices for Peace, which basically aligns itself with the Students for Justice in Palestine, with saying that Jews have no right to have a Jewish state. And I have a lot of animus against that group because, people sometimes compare them to capos, the Jews who worked for the Nazis in World War II. And I want to make it clear that's a ridiculous comparison. I'll tell you why. The Jews who cooperated with the Nazis during the war in concentration camps and other places, I think did something awful, awful, awful. But I don't think anybody thinks that this is what they aspired to do in their lifetimes. I think they did it because they were so afraid of being killed that they would do anything the Nazis demanded of them. The difference between them and Jewish Voices for Peace is everything they're doing. All the hatred they're spewing against Israel, all of it is done totally voluntarily.
Rabbi, I'd like to get back away from politics and more about your life work. You co-authored 2 books with your friend Dennis Prager, 9 questions people ask about Judaism and why the Jews, the reasons for anti-Semitism. You wrote books, one of them, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, which inspired Senator Lieberman and Connie Max to establish a national Speak No Evil Day. Your book, Jewish Literacy, the most important things to know about the Jewish religion, its people and its history, is still the most widely selling book on Judaism in the past 2 decades. And of course, the Rabbi, which was a bestseller. You consider your book a code of Jewish ethics, You Shall Be Holy, which was published in 2008 and won the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish books to be your life's work. Tell us about your books and which of them represents your views and who you are.
Well, they pretty much all do, because it's very hard to write a book, because writing a book really demands a lot of time and attention and research. So it's hard to write a book without having a strong feeling about it. And each of those books, at the time I was writing it, I felt this is the best thing I could be doing with my life at the time.
Which of them would you take with you to an island?
Which then would I like other people to take to an island? Look, when I wrote Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, I really felt that the misusage of words was having a very poisonous effect in Jewish life and in American life. So I felt Jews had contributed a lot to America, but we didn't always contribute a lot to America as Jews. And I wanted to make this notion of Lashon Hara, for example, and really, help what's going on. So each of these books, in a different way, mattered very much to me. The one book that when I was writing it, I didn't feel was that important, though turned out to have its own impact, which was my book on Jewish humor. I was very moved because I always considered that like a dessert more than a main course. And I was very moved some years ago when a man who I really venerated, a very extraordinary person, Abraham Twersky. Did you by any chance ever interview him?
Of course.
Okay. So Rabbi Dr. Twersky, told me that he had a cousin who had a bad cancer and was pretty clear was not going to get better. And their talks were getting so downbeat that he finally said to his cousin, and they spoke pretty often, he said, let's agree every time we speak, we're going to tell each other a good Jewish joke. And he told me, I want you to know your book was often from where I drew the jokes. And there have been few compliments that made me so happy and proud. So yes. Yeah, I wanted to always write in different genres also. When I was in high school, I knew I wanted to be a writer. And usually when you're a young person, you say you want to be a writer, usually it's fiction you're thinking of. I remember in high school, I did start work on a novel. And so I've tried to write in different genres. So obviously, my most known writings are, the nonfiction books that you enumerated. But I also have written 4 murder mysteries, 3 of which star a rabbi as the hero detective. The fact that most people don't know about these books is probably why I haven't written more of them.
We know the Ramchal wrote plays, right?
No, you know that. I didn't know that. Really?
Rav Chaim Luzzatto wrote plays. So you still have hope.
I'm in good company there. Yeah. And then I wrote a movie with my friend David Brandish called The Quarrel, based on a short story of Chaim Grada's.
I saw the movie.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah.
There's a scene in the movie that I actually like, if it's the same movie. I think when the Orthodox friend is on a train and there's a woman who's sitting across from him and she's uncomfortable and she says, "Why do you have to show your Judaism? I'm also Jewish, but I don't have to brag about it and show about it and all of these things. That's why they hate us." And he says, "Sorry, ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm Amish." And she says, "I respect you for sticking to your tradition." Remember that scene?
I remember it very well. And, what she says to him, she says, by dressing in this old fashioned manner of dress, you make us all seem so ridiculous. Right. Yes, that was. And in fact, I think Rabbi Twersky told me he had a similar incident happen in his life. But we got that into the quarrel.
You've been a rabbi and a teacher for over 50 years and counting. While most of your colleagues have retired or moved on, you keep leading and educating us. You transcend all types of Jewish doctrines. You feel as comfortable in traditional Orthodox shul as you do in renewal ones, and as such, you're unique. Tell us about the changing world of Judaism in the US and the world, and how you see the transformation of Jewish practice and Jewish family during your tenure.
Unfortunately, in many ways, the news is not so good. I think a growing and larger percentage of Jews who are committed are Orthodox. In one sense, that's very good news. But in the sense that we're losing a lot of other Jews, it's not, good news. It's there are a lot of unaffiliated Jews. By the way, it's not good news in American society in general either. We keep learning that the largest growing religion in the United States is none. People who have no commitment to any religious traditions, and they're certainly opting out of Christianity. And guess what? Right now, Christians represent a significant percentage of those who are very friendly and pro-Israel. And one thing about the far left in general, they're atheists. They religion, and they often hate religion. And I think it's not unrelated to their hatred of Israel, which translates into wanting to see terrible things happen to Israel and to Jews. In the general, when Dennis and I started writing, there was a tremendous growing appreciation for Judaism. This was a whole phenomenon. In some ways, it tied into the 6-Day War and Jewish pride in the aftermath of the war. But I know that my books on Jewish subjects sold in much larger numbers than they are now. Now, you could say, okay, people have had enough books from Telushkin, so others are growing. But the problem is, I wouldn't say that would make me happy, but it would make me happier than what the reality seems to be. Jewish books in general are not selling.
Books in general are not selling.
Yes, that's right. There's no question that computers have accustomed us to only paying attention for much more limited amounts of time. So book sales have fallen off. Jewish book sales have dramatically fallen off. So that's disturbing to me. Now, book sales have done well again in the Orthodox world. I'm sure that they, to some extent, have fallen off there. But the phenomenon of ArtScroll has been a marked phenomenon.
We were called Ama Sefer. Now we should be called Ama Text.
That's nice. That's nice. The people of the text. People take that text very seriously. If I'm not mistaken, the first person who called Jews people of the book, I think, was Muhammad. and he meant people of the book, the Bible.
Bible.
Yes. And by and large, Jews have played a significant role in secularizing America. In addition to the ACLU, Jews were very active in the groups that wanted to remove prayer from American schools, and the acknowledgement of one God above us whose demands are ethical, I think actually was having a very positive impact on American society today, in which many people don't see ethics as being of supreme importance. So that was a bad thing, I think, that happened in the Jewish community. One of the few, interestingly, and I learned this when I was writing his biography, was the Rebbe.
My question was twofold. One about your relation with Orthodoxy, and you pointed to the dwindling numbers that are not in the Orthodoxy. But when I interviewed the Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, Zecher Tzedek V'Bracha, I think you were friends with him.
I love Zalman, yes.
He pointed out to me that all the things that looked too modern in yesteryears become the norm of a time. Is it true that what we call renewal, such as Romamu, are doing better on the upswing, while reform and conservative are not doing as well? Is that another, like the Chavurah group in the 70s? Is there a parallel, like a growth that you see there?
I think the success or non-success of renewal has tended to be based overwhelmingly on individual rabbis.
Yeah, personalities.
Right. And what's also interesting is David Ingbar, for whom I have a very high regard, came out of a very observant household background. There were things that he came to either reject or didn't want to practice exactly like that, but that passion came from there. And the other renewal rabbi from whom I have an extremely high regard is in Boulder, Colorado, my friend Tirza Firestone. And Tirza also comes out of a very traditional background. I remember, when she was in my house, I remember her picking up one of my grandfather's Sfarim and really starting reading through it. And I think Zalman in his later years was concerned that some of the renewal rabbis didn't have enough of the traditional Jewish learning.
Yeah.
He disagreed with the general Orthodox curriculum for rabbis, which is overwhelmingly involving Talmud study, because he felt that they needed training in other areas as well. But so, as I said, as regards renewal, it depends, I think, rather than that one word opening up the whole world to us, it depends on the rabbis within it, who are very powerful figures.
Rabbi, you touched on the Rebbe before, and I want to get back to it because it's important. And I did interview Simon Jacobson, who was his choser. You spent a long time gathering material for your book about the Rebbe. Tell us about him, and how did you manage to recreate him in your book? And he was worried for all Jews, from sending Jews to the street all over the world to bring Jews and help Jews, bring tefillin to men and candles for women. He was an optimist and non-judgmental. Tell us about him, memories, events, examples. Help recreate him for us.
The word extraordinary gets overused, but he really was extraordinary, which meant that he was far beyond the ordinary. One of the things I came to appreciate in particular was that his love of Jews was really very, very sincere. When I mentioned a few moments ago that the Rebbe wanted to see some sort of prayer retained in the public schools, By and large, when the Supreme Court outlawed all prayer in public schools, the Orthodox world didn't seem to take much of a position on it. And part of the reason was because none of their children went to public schools, so they weren't feeling it as acutely. The Rebbe was. The Rebbe said, don't you realize that there are many Jewish children who go through an entire year never praying? So, and the prayer they said in the public schools was an acknowledgement of God as the sovereign ruler of the universe. So that was another example. The Rebbe was very opposed to former Jews, observant Jews, feeling self-righteous. When he was one of the Israeli chief rabbis, whose name just slipped out of my head. When he met the Rebbe as a young man, and he had been, ordained, he was already a musmach, already had rabbinic ordination, and the Rebbe said, so what are you involved in? And he said, I'm involved in kiruv rechokim. Kiruv rechokim is an idiomatic expression in Hebrew, which literally means bringing near those who are far away. And it's understood as meaning trying to expose non-observant Jews to Judaism and bringing them closer to practice. And the Rebbe was just instinctively reacted against that sort of language. He said, how do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachak? They're all Karov Lashem. How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far? They're all near in God's eyes. And so that was just symptomatic of his approach because of his great love for all Jews.
What's spectacular is that the Rebbe, the Rav, the Rebbe's son-in-law, Rav Lichtenstein, and others.
Rav Soloveitchik's son-in-law. I think you said the Rebbe.
Sorry. Yeah. They were all masters in secular studies. I know Rav Lichtenstein would mention Shakespeare in the same breath as, Talmud studies. Meir Soloveitchik, the Rav Aaron's grandson, he's mentioning secular subjects in art and literature. That had a greater appeal to those who are not what we call black hat or Haredim. And today we have a very strong dislike in the Haredi or the religious community for anybody who is wasting their time on secular studies. How do you settle this?
No, it's funny. People often think that authors of books write the books sequentially. They start on page 1 and go straight through to the end. I've never done that. I would usually write a chapter when I felt ready to write it. I spent more years on the Rebbe book than in any book I've written. I spent 5 years. And in retrospect, I realized I could have used even more time. So the first chapter I felt ready to write, and this was after about a year and a half or more, was why people shouldn't go to college and why those who go to college shouldn't drop out. I remember I sent it into my agent, Richard Pine, and he said, Joseph, this is terrible. You're going to write a book about a major rabbi telling people not to go to college? I said, look, read the chapter and you'll see what his reasoning was. But he also felt that those who had started on that path should finish their degrees. So he respected that knowledge. I think he felt that a lot of people go to college at very impressionable ages. Do you question that? All these people who have been at these horrendous, disgusting, vile anti-Israel events, a couple of years earlier when they were in high school, I don't think they would have participated in such activities. I think going to university actually made them worse human beings, not better human beings.
But this is the minority. Most Jews are not the ones that dance with Hamas sympathizers. I meant in my question more about the rigor of learning God's world for what it is and not one angle only, the Talmud, or as you said before, being religious is being kind. And being kind it means inclusive, and not inclusive as a ism, but inclusive as seeing God's world everywhere, not only in the books.
Yeah, I think that we need to have different, Shivim Panim La Torah. There are 70 faces to the Torah. There are different ways people are going to relate to their Judaism. And I am a big fan in general of inclusivity in that regard. Different things will jump out to people. And, you mentioned earlier that in the 70s, when I was in my 20s, so much of my involvement in Jewish life was focused around protesting on behalf of Russian Jews. And different things jump out at us. And we don't want to have all Jews being exactly the same.
Rabbi,
Mm-hmm.
Judaism in many ways is an evolving religion and tradition, but in other areas it's frozen and unchanging. A woman's role in the family has changed. She's an earner, she is a legal voice equal to her husband's. But when it comes to a Jewish role, has that changed? Does a Jewish observant woman have more involved egalitarian role in the changing world? We know your wife is a scholar, she's a writer, and you must help each other. How do you see this change in our world?
I think there is just a much greater openness to women playing more active roles in the world than they did in the past. Rabbi Rishkin was approached. There were women in his congregation when Rabbi Rishkin was still a rabbi in the United States, the Lincoln Square Synagogue, who were involved in intensive Torah study, but it was at a time when then in most Orthodox shuls, women couldn't hold the Torah. And they wanted to dance with the Torah. They didn't necessarily want to dance mixed dancing, but they wanted to dance with the Torah. And that has gradually, become much more common. So Riskin did it. And at the time he did it, a prominent Orthodox rabbi who lived near Riskin said his shul now can no longer be considered an Orthodox shul. And Riskin was very much a Talmud of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and Soloveitchik totally justified what Riskin had done, and he said, "And I'm going to go give a lecture at your shul, and then let him claim that your shul is no longer an Orthodox shul." So things happen that we can't necessarily predict when they're going to happen, but if they're right and just, they do happen, and things are corrected. I think it's good that we don't necessarily always move too quickly, but injustices got to be corrected when we start noticing that they're unjust.
A couple of thousand years is not quickly, and
that is correct.
We hope it's not going to take another 2,000 years. You were also friendly with the late Reb Shlomo, who you come to the Carlebach Shul often also, and there women dance with Torah,
Yes.
and he was very inclusive as well. And he was certainly not respected then by Orthodox rabbi as he is seen now retroactively. Tell us about your friendship and experience.
I actually didn't have such an extensive friendship with Reb Shlomo. My wife was an even bigger, I wouldn't say fan, because I actually was a fan, but she went there more often than I did. But I'll tell you an interesting quote she heard Shlomo say about this very issue when some people claimed women shouldn't hold the Torah. He said, if women are good enough to carry our babies, they are also should be able to carry our Torahs. And that's it's not just an effective debater's line. I think it's actually a very, very powerful and effective line.
Thank you for reminding us that. Rabbi, what did you tell your children with regards to observance? How is their life different than yours? Have they turned to the right, to the left? tell us about your role as an educator to your own children, and how is it different than when you were a child?
My children have made some of their own decisions on what speaks to them more powerfully within Judaism, sometimes in ways, so to speak, more so than me or less so than me. They're all passionate. They're all passionate supporters of Judaism and the Jewish people. I tried to set up for them a model of what mattered to me, and they saw in making ethical and other decisions. I'm not going to start reading it on the air, but because yesterday I got a very extraordinary, might have been one of the most extraordinary letters I've ever gotten in my life from one of my daughters for Father's Day, because yesterday was Father's Day in the United States, on how I presented her a model of what sort of person I'd want to be, and by implication, that she should be. And it's interesting. What was moving to me was this. I said probably about 45 minutes ago, I said, my wife Devorah said to me, when I had to make a decision in life about a difficult issue, I should try and do what my father would have done. I should imagine what my father would have done. From the way my children have spoken to me, I think in some ways I've ended up being a model for them in that regard too. And I have a lot of nachas from them.
Beautiful. About different topics, how do you view the Haredi secular divide in Israel?
It's a very unfortunate divide, because it's not that I'm always concerned about the unity of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, we've known for a long time that the one subject that can unify the Jewish people is anti-Semitism, because we all know it's a threat to all of us. I don't know if I have anything innovative to say on the secular Israeli divide, because everybody comments on it. Each, I think, has to learn to respect what good things do come out of the other.
There's no need for innovation, but we look for people inside one camp to comment on the respect we should have and the peace we should make, righteousness that we should leave behind in building a society, especially one that is so close to our heart. And that's where I ask you about.
Some years ago, there was a rabbi in the Haredi world. He was not Hasidic. I'm not going to mention him by name, because what I'm going to say about him is not complimentary. And there were many people who found nice traits in this person. But he got up before an election that was upcoming in Israel. He wanted to make sure people didn't vote for the Labor Party, which, well, the Labor Party in Israel has declined greatly over the years in size. But he made some sarcastic comment about, the people on kibbutzim, because the majority of kibbutzim were not, overwhelming majority were not religious kibbutzim, who eat unkosher food. Can they even be so-called Jews? And the next day in Haaretz, which is a decidedly secular newspaper in Israel, they printed a very powerful cartoon showing a military cemetery, and you see with all these people's, the dates of their births and deaths, and then overriding it is, can these people be called Jews? So there are real people like that. I'll tell you a story. This is really, really not a known story. And I just came to me at this moment. I remembered it because I write about it in my book, but I've almost never seen people refer to it. There was a group, I think its name was Brecha, that helped Jews escape out of Eastern Europe in the post-World War II period. And it was the people who ran the group were overwhelmingly what we would call Chiloni, secular Jews. And Lubavitcher Rebbitzin, this is a very remarkable thing, used to call them tzaddikim without tefillin. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing, and it's fun.
Seeing the kindness in the people on the other side of our ideological divide.
Right, that they could be tzaddikim who didn't put on tefillin, and the willingness to appreciate what we don't, what we don't do. I mean, the willingness to appreciate Chabadniks, or I did not grow up in a household that was particularly fond of Satmar, but I happen to know because my wife is a chaplain, and she's known from work at various hospitals that a lot of very good things have been done by Satmar in the realm of Bikur Cholim.
Beautiful, beautiful. Rabbi, touching on other topics because time is short. Rabbi, how do you see the esoteric topics of Mashiach, Olam Haba, Acharit Hayamim, and how do you reconcile everything with a God that allows pain and suffering in the world?
So I'm not going to speak at length because you can end up speaking about this for hours. And obviously, anybody who claims to be a believer in God or the God of the Torah or the God of Judaism, who can say that they're never troubled by the injustices in the world, has a pretty cold heart. On the other hand, rationally speaking, that's it. Once God gave human beings free will, that's the issue we have to confront. If people say, how can I believe in God after the Holocaust? I would, say to them, how can you believe in human beings after the Holocaust? Then you really have nothing you can believe in, because it was human beings who built Auschwitz, not God. Why did God allow it? Because if God stopped everybody every time they tried to do something bad, we would no longer be human beings. We would be robots, So we can't have that. Does that, first of all, it doesn't in any case answer natural evil like earthquakes, the tsunami. So all I can fall back is on the medieval proverb. I think I once found who actually said it, but I don't. If you happen to know, I'll be grateful. Lu yadativ hayitiv. If I knew God, I'd be God.
Close enough. It's close enough.
God. What I will say, though, matters to me very much as a matter of faith, again, which I can't prove, is a belief in afterlife. If for any reason I stop believing in afterlife, I think it would become impossible for me to observe the mitzvah of Yahavta, to love God. Because what's transparently obvious is that too often evil has triumphed in the lives of individuals who were murdered, children who were born with horrible conditions, a whole host of things. Can I imagine how that will redress the grievance? I can't imagine, but I believe that God can do something, and I think we all have to have a chance at more than one life. So for me, belief in afterlife is a very great principle of faith.
Speaking of these esoteric topics, other religions spend a lot of time talking about those topics, and yet in the Torah, in our Talmud, not much is written about Mashiach, Olam Haba, and the afterlife. It's kind of interesting how the promise of the reward for the mitzvahs is the afterlife, and yet nothing is written about it.
Yes, that's right. As it has been wisely said, because those who know aren't speaking, and those who are speaking don't know. Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, what else can it be? Yeah.
But the Torah is full of things that we don't know. Why hasn't the Torah elaborated on that?
What's it supposed to elaborate? I mean, giving us exact descriptions of what it's going to be like? Certainly, And I wish Islamists didn't believe in an afterlife. We know the crazy thing where they're told, oh, that you'll be surrounded by 70 virgins. Now, first of all, I don't believe it. And the question I have is that their reward for having carried out acts of terror? Or is this the punishment for the 70 virgins who had lived horrible lives? Can you imagine being sentenced to spend eternity with a disgusting, evil person?
Yeah, but even we just read the Chukotai, and we have the brachot and the klalot. In the brachot, in the blessings, shouldn't it say something about the reward in the olam haba, in the world to come?
Would I be happy if it did? Yes, but I accept that it didn't. Are there things that, if they were different in the Torah, would I be happy? Yes, I would have been happier if the Torah had outlawed slavery, categorically outlawed it. What it permitted was still much better than what was permitted thousands of years later in the South. You could be sentenced to death for killing a slave. Here, nothing bad. You'd have to release a slave if you knocked out his eye, which is a terrible, terrible thing, or his tooth, which is not such a terrible thing. I remember I was once on Dennis's show, Religion on the Line, where he always had on a rabbi and usually had a minister and a priest. And he asked us to ask each other questions. And the minister who was on that week was a fundamentalist minister, who believed in damnation if you didn't accept Jesus. And I said to him, there are things I wish weren't in the Torah, but they're there, like what I just said about I wish slavery had been prohibited, but I can see it within the context of the Torah. I know you believe that anybody who doesn't accept Jesus will go to hell, but do you wish that that wasn't the case? So he had some answer. Obviously the question made him uncomfortable, but so that's what I would say.
Lastly,
Yes.
Rabbi, what would you tell a young kid who is maybe modern Orthodox or maybe left his practice of Jewish faith and going to college, or is a young professional? And because today it's very hard to reconcile the material, physical world and the religious, spiritual world. How would you strengthen or give them advice about how to approach merging the two or being more sensitized to his Jewish background and faith?
What I would say is hold on to Shabbos. The practices of Judaism have instilled in the Jews values that have, by and large, I think, led us to be better people, and to think you can rid yourselves of an aspect of it without losing a lot of other values, I think will probably turn out to not be true. So I'm not saying you have to accept everything in every law in the Shulchan Aruch. That I would say the ethics of Judaism, it's very, very important to hold on to, though we can argue what those ethics are. And the Ben Adam Lamakom, I think, have an enormous capacity to help us. I think it's a good thing learning at the age of 6 that you can't have every candy bar in the candy store. It teaches something about self-control. It's important to learn that there are things that are simply unkosher. My friend Dennis said that the first words he ever learned to read in English at 6 were pure vegetable shortening only. Obviously, he was joking, but that's what he meant. It's not a bad thing to learn. You can't have every candy bar in the candy store. So be very conscious of what you choose to do and what you don't choose to do and how you assess things. And make sure you have something to hand over to your children that can help make their lives richer and better.
That's a wonderful place to end this. I would love to speak to you for many more hours, but I will end with one thing that I ask all the rabbis I interviewed to do, and that is to sing something, a nigun from that has a meaning to you, maybe from your father or grandfather's dish, from your bubbas, from your grandmother, anything that you had learned to take with you and enjoy.
My grandfather had a tune for the Manishtana that over the years I haven't heard elsewhere. Everybody who ever comes to our Seder learns it. I don't think it's particularly spread. So I'm now going to do something I never do, which is sing in public or something that's going to be seen by the public. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh, nishtana mikol haleilot. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh, nishtana bechol haleilot. שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים חמץ ומצה. הלילה הזה, כולו מצה. Anyway, have you heard that one before?
No, but it's growing on me.
Good.
Let's commit to celebrate Pesach together. Thank you so much for taking this time.